I need a cook, not a wife. He said it before she even set down her bag. Clara Bennett stood in the doorway of the Calloway Ranch, travel-worn and hungry, and those 7 words hit her square in the chest like a closed fist. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn around. She just looked that hard-eyed rancher straight in the face and said, "Good, because I didn't come here to be one." If you're watching from your city, drop it in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now and stay with us until the very end. You won't want to miss what happens next. The advertisement had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone soft. The ink slightly smeared at the corners from Clara's fingers, reading it again and again on the long ride north. Ranch cook wanted. Room and board provided. Serious applicants only. Inquire Calloway Ranch, Harlan County, Montana Territory. Serious applicants only. She had almost laughed when she first read that, sitting in the back of a crowded boarding house in Billings, with 3 other women who were also out of money and out of options. Serious. As though a woman who had buried a husband, sold every piece of furniture she owned down to the bed frame, and spent 4 months eating whatever work she could scrape up with her hands, wasn't serious enough. She was 29 years old. She had been a widow for 14 months. And she was done pretending that dignity looked like waiting quietly for something better to come along. She took the stage north. The ride took 2 days and left her with a stiff back and dust in places she didn't care to think about. The last stretch she walked because the driver turned east 3 miles before the ranch road, and she wasn't about to ask anyone for a favor she didn't have coins to repay. She carried 1 bag. Everything she owned that still had value was inside it. A good wool coat, a set of kitchen knives wrapped in cloth, and a letter of character reference from Mrs. Eloise Hartley of Billings, who had employed Clara as a boarding house cook for 6 weeks before the establishment closed without warning. Clara was not a small woman. She had never been small. She had grown up in a family that cooked well and ate well, and the shape of her body reflected a life spent standing over stoves and feeding people from the time she was old enough to reach the counter. Her first husband, Thomas, had called her beautiful. He had meant it. She knew the difference between a man who meant it and a man who said it for other reasons, and Thomas had always meant it. Thomas had been dead for 14 months, and she still thought about him every single morning before she was fully awake in that thin, merciful moment before memory returned. She stopped thinking about Thomas when she saw the ranch. It wasn't what she'd imagined. She had pictured something prosperous, something with fresh paint on the fence rails and a kitchen garden laid out in careful rows. What she found was a property that had once been prosperous and was now fighting to stay that way. The fences along the road needed mending. The yard was clean, she'd give it that, but there was a kind of bareness to it, a stripped-down quality, like a man who had sold off everything that wasn't strictly necessary and was now running on what was left. She walked to the front door and knocked. The man who answered looked at her the way people look at something they weren't expecting and weren't sure they wanted. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from actual work and not from any particular effort toward it. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples. His jaw was set like he'd made a decision about the world a long time ago and hadn't found sufficient reason to revise it. He was not unkind-looking exactly. He was just closed, the way a house looks when all the shutters are drawn in broad daylight. He looked at her. He looked at her bag. He looked back at her. "You're here about the cook position." It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. "Clara Bennett. I cooked professionally for 3 years at my late husband's restaurant in Laramie and 6 weeks at Hartley's boarding house in Billings. I have a letter of reference." She held out the envelope. He didn't take it immediately. "How'd you get here?" he asked. "Walked the last 3 miles. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not admiration exactly, more like recalculation. He took the envelope. He opened it, read it, folded it, put it in his shirt pocket without handing it back. Then he looked at her again, and that was when he said it. "I need a cook, not a wife." The words landed exactly the way he probably intended them to, as a boundary, as a warning, as a preemptive correction to whatever assumptions she might have arrived with. and Clara felt the sting of it, the small, specific humiliation of being looked at, and immediately categorized as a woman who needed to be warned off. But she had walked 3 miles with a bag on her shoulder, and she was $30 from having nothing. So she looked him straight in his serious gray eyes and she said, "Good, because I didn't come here to be one." A beat passed. Then Wyatt Calloway stepped back from the door and said, "Kitchen's through the back." Her name, as far as the ranch was concerned, was Mrs. Bennett. Wyatt was particular about that from the first day. Not Clara, not the cook, Mrs. Bennett. She understood the distinction without having to ask. It was respect of a specific and careful kind, the kind that kept lines drawn clearly so that no one had to wonder where they stood. She respected him for it, actually. It was easier to work for a man who said plainly what he expected than for one who smiled and left you guessing. The kitchen was large, and it had once been well equipped. She could tell from the good bones of it, the solid iron range, the deep dry sink, the shelving that had been built by someone who understood how a working kitchen operated. But it had the feel of a space that had been managed rather than cooked in for some time. Managed meaning food prepared out of necessity, nothing more. She found a pot of something on the back of the stove that she guessed had been there since morning, beans overcooked to mush with salt, and not much else. She tasted it. She set the spoon down. She found the larder. The supplies were adequate but uninspired. The ranch wasn't starving, but it wasn't eating well either, and she knew from long experience that the difference between adequate food and good food was not always a question of money. It was a question of attention, of caring enough to do the extra thing. She got to work. By the time supper was called, she had made a proper beef stew with herbs from a small bunch she'd found going dry near the window, a pan of cornbread and a pot of strong coffee. Nothing that required a miracle. Just food made with the full weight of her attention. The ranch hands came in from outside, expecting the usual. The first man through the door stopped so completely that the man behind him walked into his back. "Lord Almighty," the first man said. He was young, maybe 22, with a sunburned neck and ears that stuck out slightly. Is that real cornbread?" "Sit down before it gets cold," Clara said. There were 6 of them, plus Wyatt, who came in last and took his place at the head of the table without ceremony. Clara served from the pot. She watched because she always watched. It was how she cooked, how she understood what people needed, and she saw the change happen in real time. Shoulders dropped. Conversations started. The young man with the sunburned ears ate 2 bowls and then looked genuinely surprised at himself. Wyatt ate without comment. But he finished everything on his plate, and when he pushed his chair back, he paused for just a fraction of a second in the doorway, like a man reconsidering something before he walked out. Clara began clearing the table. That was when the girl appeared. She was 12 years old, and she had her father's eyes, the same serious gray, the same quality of watching everything from just outside the circle of participation. She was not unfriendly. She was not friendly either. She stood at the edge of the kitchen doorway and regarded Clara with an expression of careful neutrality that Clara suspected had been assembled over a long time, and with considerable effort. "You're the new cook," the girl said. "I am. You must be Emma. Pa told me not to bother you." "You're not bothering me." Clara kept moving, stacking the plates. "Are you hungry? There's stew left." Emma considered this. "I already ate." "Then sit down anyway. Keep me company while I clean up." Another pause. Then Emma sat. She sat the way children sit when they're trying not to look like they want to be somewhere, with perfect posture, and her hands folded precisely in her lap, as though casual comfort was something she'd forgotten the procedure for. Clara worked and didn't push. She'd learned a long time ago that some people needed to come to conversation the way cats come to warmth, gradually on their own terms, without being called directly. After a few minutes, Emma said, "Mrs. Fowler didn't let me in the kitchen." "Who's Mrs. Fowler?" "The last cook. She said kitchens weren't for children." Clara set a clean cup on the table and poured milk into it and slid it toward the girl without comment. Emma looked at the cup. She looked at Clara. "Everybody leaves. Emma said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact she was delivering flat and plain, the way children sometimes tell you the truest things, because they haven't yet learned to dress them up. Clara sat down across from her. I know what that's like, she said. I've had a few people leave me too. Emma's eyes moved to Clara's hands. No wedding ring, but the small pale line where one had been for years. Your husband? The girl asked. Yes. Emma absorbed this. Mine was my mother, she said, 4 years ago. I know, Clara said quietly. I'm sorry, Emma. They sat together in the quiet kitchen for a while. After that, the girl drinking her milk and Clara finishing the dishes, and neither of them needed to fill the silence with anything, because sometimes silence is the most honest thing two people can offer each other. The first full week was a reckoning. Clara learned the ranch the way she learned every kitchen she'd ever worked in, by paying attention to where the problems lived. And the Calloway Ranch had problems. Not disasters, not failures, but the specific accumulation of small surrenders that happened when a capable man was running everything alone, and had been for too long. The ranch hands were not bad workers. They were unmotivated, which was different. There was a young man named Pete, the one with the sunburned ears, who was clearly talented with horses, but had no particular investment in anything beyond his weekly wages. There was an older hand named Clem, who did his work steadily, but had a soreness in his right shoulder that he was trying to hide because he was afraid of being let go. There was a third man, Jed, who was smart and resentful about the fact that no one had noticed he was smart, which made him lazy in ways that looked like laziness but were really just protest. Clara noticed all of it. Over meals, over coffee breaks, over the small 10-minute conversations she made a point of having with each of them in the first week, conversations that felt like nothing in particular, but were in fact her gathering everything she needed to understand about the household she was now a part of. She didn't interfere, she just cooked, but she cooked specifically. For Clem, she started preparing food that was easier to eat with the right hand, carrying the work things that didn't require a lot of cutting. For Pete, she asked casual questions about the horses over breakfast, until he was coming in 15 minutes early, just to have someone to tell about what he'd noticed that morning. For Jed, she started saying things like, "You seem like someone who'd know what's the best way to handle this," and watching the resentment slowly leak out of him as he was given credit for being perceptive. She wasn't doing it strategically. She was just doing what she'd always done. She paid attention to people, and then she responded to what she found. It was the same principle as cooking. You work with what's actually in front of you, not with what you wish was there. By the end of the first week, the hands were staying at the dinner table 20 minutes longer than they had before she arrived. By the end of the second week, there were 3 extra men sitting at the table. Ranch hands from neighboring properties who'd heard something about the food at Calloway's and found reasons to be nearby at mealtimes. Wyatt noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly. But one morning she was in the kitchen before dawn, and she heard him stop outside the door. She knew his footstep by then, heavier on the left side, and pause there for a moment, and then move on. He was watching. She could feel it. Not in an uncomfortable way, in the way that careful people watch things they're trying to understand. The trouble started in the second week, and it came in the form of a man Clara had never met, but recognized instantly from the way every other person on the ranch reacted to his name. She was in the kitchen when she heard raised voices out in the yard. She didn't go to look, it wasn't her place, but she kept her hands busy and her ears open, and she heard enough. "Mercer's man again," Clem said when he came in for coffee afterward. His face was tight. "Third time this month. What does he want?" Clara asked. Clem hesitated, not because he was hiding something, but because the weight of what he was carrying was just heavier than casual conversation. "The land," he finally said. "Or more exactly, what's under it. There's a spring, deep one. Come dry season, that spring is going to be the only source of water in the whole East Valley. Hank Mercer's been trying to get his hands on it for 2 years. And Mr. Calloway won't sell. Mr. Calloway wouldn't sell his own shadow to Hank Mercer if Mercer was offering cash and a handshake from God Almighty. Clem paused. Pardon my language. I've heard worse, Clara said. She poured the coffee. Is it dangerous, Mercer? Clem looked at her. He was a man who chose his words carefully, and the pause before he answered told her more than the words themselves. He's the kind of man, Clem said slowly, who never does anything himself that he can get someone else to do for him. Clara thought about that for a long time after Clem left. That evening she was still thinking about it when Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway. The girl had a habit of materializing at the edge of things. Doorways, conversations, mealtimes, like she was always testing whether entry was permitted before committing to it. Papa's not going to sell, Emma said, not as information, as a statement of something she needed to be true. I know, Clara said, even if it gets bad. Clara looked at the girl. 12 years old with her father's jaw and her father's eyes, and the kind of certainty in her face that only comes from being afraid of the alternative. Has it gotten bad before? Clara asked. Emma was quiet for a moment. Last summer, they cut the fence on the north pasture 3 times. 2 of the hands quit. They said it wasn't worth the trouble. She paused. I heard Papa walking the floor at night for a month. Clara set down what she was holding. Come here, she said. Emma came. Clara sat down at the kitchen table, and Emma sat across from her, and Clara said, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to really hear it. Emma straightened. Ready. Your father built this place. He knows this land better than any man alive. And from what I've seen in 2 weeks, he's the kind of man who doesn't quit when things get hard. Clara looked at the girl steadily. That doesn't mean it won't get hard. It means that when it does, he won't be the one to break. Emma absorbed this. Her jaw tightened slightly, that Calloway jaw set against the world. Are you going to stay? The girl asked. When it gets bad. Clara held the girl's gaze. I signed on for work, she said. I don't walk away from work I've committed to. It wasn't a promise of love. It wasn't a declaration of loyalty. It was the most honest thing Clara could offer, and Emma, serious, careful Emma, received it as exactly what it was. She nodded once, and then she said, Can I help with dinner? Wyatt found them working together when he came in that night. Emma rolling out biscuit dough at the table with concentration fierce enough to suggest surgery, Clara working beside her with the quiet patience of someone who'd taught 100 things to 100 people and understood that the teaching mattered less than the presence. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He didn't say anything, but Clara felt him there, that particular stillness of a man who has come across something unexpected and is trying to decide what to do with the feeling it creates. Later, when Emma had gone to bed, and Clara was finishing up the last of the kitchen work, she heard his step in the hall, and then he appeared in the doorway. She hasn't done that in a long time, he said. Clara didn't have to ask what he meant. She's got good hands for it, she said. Patient, careful. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. He had the habit of thinking before he spoke that Clara was beginning to recognize as one of his better qualities. She used to cook with her mother, he said finally. After Eleanor died, she stopped. Wouldn't go near the kitchen. Clara kept her hands moving. She didn't want him to feel watched while he said this. Then tonight, she just... He stopped, started again. She asked me if she could help the cook. She came on her own, Clara said. I didn't push her. I know you didn't. He was quiet again for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice had something different in it. Not softness exactly, because this was not a soft man, but something more like the grain of real wood under old paint. Thank you, Mrs. Bennet. Clara looked up then. She's a good girl, she said. She just needs people to stop being careful around her and start being real with her. Wyatt's eyes met hers. There was something in that moment, not romantic, not dramatic, but real. The specific recognition of one person by another. The acknowledgement that said, I see you. I know what you just did. And I don't have words big enough for it, so I'm just going to stand here and let you see that I know. "Good night, Mrs. Bennet," he said. "Good night, Mr. Calloway." He left. Clara stood in the kitchen alone for a moment, her hands still the lamp burning low. She had told Emma she'd stay when it got hard. She was only now beginning to understand exactly how hard it was going to get. The morning after Emma rolled out biscuits for the first time in 4 years, Clara found a small folded piece of paper on the kitchen counter. No name on it. Just 3 words in a child's careful handwriting. They were good. Clara stood there holding that note for a long moment. Then she tucked it into her apron pocket and got back to work. That was the thing about small moments. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't come with music or ceremony. They just slipped in quietly between the hard things, and if you weren't paying attention, you missed them entirely. Clara had learned to pay attention. Life had made that lesson unavoidable. She made breakfast before anyone else was awake. By the time the hands began filing in, there were eggs, salt pork, fried potatoes, and a pan of the leftover biscuits from the night before, warmed through. The men came in with the usual morning quiet, the particular silence of people whose bodies are already working before their minds have caught up, and then something shifted the moment the smell hit them, and the silence became something different, less tired, more human. Pete sat down and immediately reached for a biscuit and said with his mouth already full, "Mrs. Bennet, I don't know what you put in these, but I want to know." "Butter and attention," Clara said. "That's it. That's most of it." Jed across the table made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. He was still working his way back from whatever long resentment had built up in him before Clara arrived, but she could see it loosening day by day, like ice in early spring. Not dramatic, just gradual. The way real things changed. Clem ate with his right hand, careful as always about the left shoulder, and said nothing. But when he stood to go, he stopped at the door and turned back. "Best breakfast I've had in 2 years," he said. "Maybe more." Clara nodded once. "Go do good work, Clem." He almost smiled, then he went. Wyatt came in last the way he always did after the hands, as though he needed to know they were fed before he thought about himself. Clara had noticed that about him early. He was not a man who put himself first in small things. She wondered sometimes if that made the big things harder. He sat. She set his plate in front of him. "Emma's still sleeping," she said. "She was up late." A pause. I could hear her moving around. "She was happy," Clara said simply. Wyatt looked at his plate. He picked up his fork. Then he said without looking up, "She asked me this morning if she could help you with supper tonight." Clara kept her voice level. "What did you tell her?" "I told her it was up to you." "Then she can help." He nodded. That was all. But she noticed he ate every bite on his plate that morning, which was not something he had done every morning in the 2 weeks she'd been there. She noticed. She said nothing. She filed it away the way she filed everything, quietly and for later. The 3rd week brought the first real test, and it came from the direction Clara least expected. She had started without any particular plan or announcement, doing something small after the lunch dishes were done. She would put together whatever extra food she had, an extra pot of soup, a pan of cornbread, preserved things from the larder that were close to their limit, and she would pack it carefully and set it by the back door. Then, when she had an errand that took her toward the road, she would take it with her. The Hargrove family lived 2 miles east. She knew about them from things Clem had let slip: a husband with a bad back, who couldn't work the way he used to, a wife with 3 small children, and a 4th coming, a homestead that was surviving by the thinnest of margins. Clara had never met them. She had no particular reason to go to them, except that she had extra food and they didn't, and in her experience, that was reason enough. She knocked on their door on a Thursday afternoon. The woman who answered looked at her with the specific wariness of someone who had learned that kindness from strangers often came with a price tag. She was young, younger than Clara had expected, with the kind of exhaustion in her face that had nothing to do with the hour of the day. "I'm Clara Bennet," Clara said. "I cook for the Calloway Ranch. I had extra today and I didn't want it to go to waste. I thought maybe you could use it." The woman, her name was Ruth Clara, would learn, looked at the basket. Then back at Clara. Then she said very carefully, We don't take charity. This isn't charity, Clara said. I made too much. If you don't take it, I'll have to throw it out, and I was raised that throwing out food is a sin worse than most. A beat passed. Then Ruth Hargrove opened the door wider and said, "Come in then." Clara stayed for an hour. She met the children, 3 of them all under 7, all with the particular bright-eyed energy of children who didn't yet fully understand that things were hard. She met Ruth's husband Daniel, who shook her hand from a kitchen chair and apologized for not standing. She drank 1 cup of thin coffee and listened to more than she spoke, and when she left, she promised nothing, except that she'd try to come back when she had extra again. She did come back, the following Thursday and the Thursday after that. What she didn't expect was that the 3rd time she arrived, Ruth Hargrove had a jar of preserved plums waiting on the table. "From last summer," Ruth said with something in her face that was not quite pride, but lived right next door to it. "I want you to take them back to the ranch." Clara took the plums. She used them for a Sunday dessert. When the hands asked what the occasion was, she said, "Good neighbors." That was when Jed looked up from his plate and said, "You went to the Hargroves." "I did." Jed was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Daniel Hargrove pulled me out of a ditch in a snowstorm 3 years ago. Drove 3 miles in the dark to do it. I never went back once to see how he was doing." Clara said nothing. She let it sit. The next day, without saying anything to anyone, Jed rode to the Hargrove property after his morning work was done. He came back 2 hours later with manure on his boots and the specific quiet of a man who has set down something he'd been carrying. Clara watched it happen from across the yard. She didn't remark on it. She just kept working. But Wyatt saw it too. She could tell because that evening after supper, he stood in the kitchen doorway, in the way he'd developed a habit of doing, and said, "You've been going to the Hargroves." "I have." "How long?" 3 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you say something?" "It wasn't ranch business," Clara said. "I did it on my own time with extra food that would have gone to waste. If that's a problem, I'll stop." "I didn't say it was a problem." His voice was even measured, but something underneath it was working. "I drove past their place last week. Someone had fixed the fence on their east side." "That was Pete." Wyatt blinked. "Pete. He went on his Sunday off. He said Daniel Hargrove was the first man to shake his hand when he rode into the county. Said it was past time he returned the courtesy." Clara dried her hands on a cloth. "I didn't ask him to go. I just told him Daniel had a fence that needed mending, and I couldn't do it myself." Wyatt stood there looking at her with that expression she was starting to recognize, the one that meant he was recalculating. The one that looked like a man walking into a room and finding it completely different from what he remembered. "You didn't do it yourself," he said. "No. You just made it possible for someone else to." Clara looked at him levelly. "That's usually how things get done," she said. "In my experience." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "There's a family north of the ridge. The Meekers, older couple. No hands, no children nearby. They've been struggling since the spring." He said it, and then he stopped. Clara waited. "I don't have time to get up there this week," he said finally. "Tell me what they need," Clara said. He told her. She went the following Tuesday. That was the moment, though neither of them named it or acknowledged it, when the arrangement between Clara Bennett and Wyatt Calloway quietly shifted. She was still the cook. He still called her Mrs. Bennett. The line remained drawn. But something had been added to the space between them. Not romance. Not yet, and maybe not ever. But something that was the precondition for it. The specific trust that forms when 2 people see each other clearly and find the view acceptable. It was around this time that things on the ranch began changing in ways that went beyond anything Clara had directly caused. Pete, who had always done his work adequately and nothing more, began arriving earlier. He started reorganizing the tack room on his own initiative, spending his evenings on repairs that needed doing. Clara overheard him explaining to Jed with the earnest conviction of someone who'd had a recent revelation that a place ran better when people cared whether it ran at all. Jed, who had spent 2 years doing the minimum required to avoid being let go, began doing things that weren't required of him. Small things, at first fixing a hinge that had been broken for months, noticing when a supply was low, and mentioning it before it became a problem. Clem stopped hiding his shoulder. He came to Clara one morning and said quietly that it had been bothering him for the better part of a year, and he didn't want to be let go, but he also couldn't keep pretending it was fine. Clara sent him to the doctor in town with a note she wrote herself, requesting a fair examination, and when Clem came back with a brace and instructions for modified work, she brought it to Wyatt directly. "He's worth keeping," she said flatly. "He knows this land and these animals better than anyone here. His shoulder needs rest, not replacement. If you let him go, you'll spend a year training someone to know half what he knows." Wyatt looked at her for a moment. "Did he ask you to make the case for him?" "No. He asked me not to say anything." A pause. "I'll keep him on," Wyatt said. Clem never knew it was Clara who'd spoken. But he brought her a bunch of wildflowers from the meadow the following week and set them on the kitchen counter without a word, and Clara understood. The twist came on a Thursday night, 3 weeks into this new rhythm, and it came in the form of a man Clara had never seen before. She was banking the kitchen fire for the night when she heard voices outside. Not raised, not aggressive, but with an undertone of something that made the hair on her arms stand. She moved to where she could hear without being seen, because she had learned long ago that the most important information always traveled in the moments when people thought no one was listening. The voice she didn't recognize was smooth, too smooth, the kind of smooth that's been practiced until it no longer sounds like practice. "Mr. Calloway, I represent Mr. Hank Mercer. My employer has authorized me to increase his previous offer by 40%. That is an extraordinary figure for a working ranch in the current market." Wyatt's voice came back flat and final as a door shutting. "The answer is the same as it's been every other time someone's come out here on Mercer's behalf. The ranch is not for sale. Mr. Mercer has asked me to point out that the current drought conditions. I know the drought conditions. I'm living them. Make it increasingly difficult for smaller operations to sustain. I'm going to ask you to leave my property," Wyatt said. "Tonight, now, and if Mercer wants to send another man next week, the answer will be the same." A pause. Then the smooth voice said something that made Clara go cold. "Mr. Mercer has also asked me to convey his concern for your daughter's well-being. A ranch in this kind of difficulty is no place for a child." The silence that followed was absolute. When Wyatt spoke again, his voice was so quiet that Clara had to hold her breath to hear it. "Get off my land," he said. "And tell Mercer that if he mentions my daughter's name again in any context, he will answer for it personally." She heard footsteps, one set, leaving one set, staying absolutely still. Clara stood in the kitchen and pressed her back against the wall, and thought about Emma, who was upstairs asleep in her room, who had rolled out biscuits 3 weeks ago for the first time in 4 years, who had asked every single night since then if she could help with dinner. She thought about what it meant that Mercer was using the girl as leverage, what it meant that his man had said that, what it meant that this situation was not a business dispute over a piece of land, but something with sharper edges and longer reach. She was still thinking when the back door opened and Wyatt came in. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her face. He understood immediately that she had heard. He didn't explain. He didn't apologize for the ugliness of it. He just stood there with the weight of it on him, and after a moment Clara said, "How long has he been doing this?" 2 years, Wyatt said. "Getting worse every 6 months. The fence cutting. The hands who quit." "Yes." "Was that Mercer?" Wyatt's jaw tightened. "I can't prove it." Clara stood up straight. The fear she'd felt a moment ago was still there, but something else was alongside it now. Something steadier. What does he actually want? Just the spring. The spring controls water access for 12 ranches in the East Valley. Whoever controls it controls who can run cattle and who can't. Mercer wants to own that power. He's been buying up distressed properties all through the territory. This is the last piece. Clara absorbed this. "So it's not just you." "No. It's every family in the valley. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. A plan was already forming in the back of her mind, quiet and deliberate the way she approached every problem. Not confrontational, not dramatic, but thorough. The Hargroves, she said. The Meekers. How many other families are there connected to this valley, dependent on that water? Wyatt frowned slightly. Clara. It was the first time he'd used her given name. He seemed to realize it at the same moment she did. A pause. Mrs. Bennet, this isn't your... How many families? She said again. He looked at her. He looked at the expression on her face, which was not fear and was not recklessness, but was something deliberate and practical and entirely serious. 11, he said slowly. 12, including mine. Clara nodded once. I know most of them by now, she said. Or I will by the end of the month. What are you going to do? Nothing yet, she said. I'm going to cook. I'm going to listen. I'm going to learn everything there is to know about what this valley is and what it needs. She looked at him steadily. And when the time comes to act, we'll be ready. Wyatt stood there for a moment in the lamplight, looking at this woman. This woman who had walked 3 miles with a bag on her shoulder and told him she hadn't come to be a wife, who had brought warmth back to a kitchen that had gone cold, who had given his daughter back something that grief had taken away, who was now standing in his kitchen in the late evening, calmly discussing how to outmaneuver a man who ran half the territory, and something happened behind his eyes that he wouldn't have been able to name if someone had asked. It wasn't admiration exactly, though it was that. It was something closer to recognition. The specific, rare, slightly frightening recognition of a person who understands the world the same way you do, but sees more of it than you thought was visible. Mrs. Bennet, he said. Mr. Calloway. You should know. He stopped, started again. You should know that this could get harder before it gets better. I know, she said. People have been hurt over this land. I know that too. He looked at her one more time. Then he said quietly, and with more weight than the simple words would seem to carry, "Thank you for staying." Clara held his gaze. I told Emma I don't walk away from work I've committed to, she said. She turned back to the stove. He stood there for another moment. Then he walked out. And Clara stood alone in the kitchen, her hands steady, her mind already moving forward, already counting what she knew and what she still needed to learn, and what she was going to build out of all of it. Outside, the Montana night was dark and cold and enormous. Inside, the lamp burned steady. Clara started with food. She always started with food. Not because she was limited to it, but because she understood something that most people forgot when they were frightened, that people think more clearly when they aren't hungry. Trust more easily when they feel cared for, and talk more honestly when someone has sat at a table with them and shared something real. Food was never just food. It had never been in Clara's experience. It was the first language, the oldest one. So she cooked. She sent word to Ruth Hargrove that she was holding a Sunday supper at the Calloway Ranch, and that Ruth should come and bring Daniel and the children and tell anyone else she thought might want to come. She said the same to old Mrs. Meeker, who arrived 2 hours early and immediately tried to help in the kitchen, and was installed at the table with a cup of coffee and treated like the guest of honor which she was. She said it to the Brennan family from the South Ridge, and to the Polks who ran sheep 3 miles east, and to a young couple named Aldred, who had moved up from Wyoming the previous spring and didn't yet know enough people. 7 families came that first Sunday. 19 adults, 14 children. Clara cooked for all of them. Wyatt stood at the edge of it all that afternoon and watched his yard fill with people it hadn't seen in years, and said nothing about it except when Clara passed him carrying a pot that was too heavy. He took it from her hands without being asked and carried it himself to the table. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. They were past that particular formality. What Clara was watching while she cooked and served and moved between conversations was the specific geography of people's fear. She could read. It had always been able to read it the way people positioned themselves, the things they said, and the things they carefully didn't say, the moments when a man's voice went just slightly flat when a certain subject came up. She was reading it all afternoon. By the time the family started leaving at dusk, she knew 3 things clearly. She knew that every family in the valley had been visited by Mercer's men. She knew that at least 4 of the families were being pressured with methods beyond simple persuasion. And she knew that every single one of them was facing it alone in isolation, believing they were the only one holding out, and that isolation was the thing that was slowly breaking them. That night, she sat at the kitchen table after everyone was gone and wrote down everything she remembered from the afternoon's conversations. Not notes she'd take anywhere. Just the act of writing it, of organizing it, because her mind worked better when her hands were busy and the page held what her memory couldn't carry alone. Wyatt came in late. He looked at the paper. He looked at her. "What are you working out?" he asked. "Mercer's strategy," she said. "He's not pushing all at once. He's picking at people one at a time, trying to break them individually before they realize they have numbers." Wyatt pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. This was new him, sitting down, leaning into the conversation rather than holding it from the doorway. She noticed it without acknowledging it. "The Brennans," she said. "Their water has been running low for 2 months. They think it's the drought. I don't think that's all it is. I think something's blocking their upstream flow." Wyatt was very still. "That would mean someone's interfering with—" "Yes. That's not just pressure. That's—" "I know what it is," Clara said quietly. A silence. "The Aldreds," she continued. "The young couple from Wyoming. Someone came to them last month and offered to buy their homestead claim. When they refused, they found 2 of their sheep dead the following week. They think it was coyotes." She looked up. It wasn't coyotes. Wyatt's jaw tightened in the way it did when he was working very hard to stay controlled. "How do you know all this? They didn't say any of this to me." "They didn't say it directly to anyone," Clara said. "They said it sideways. The way people say things they're ashamed of. Ashamed that it happened to them. Ashamed they don't know how to fight it." She paused. "People talk to cooks. We're safe. We're not threatening. We're just the person making the food, so people say things to us they wouldn't say to anyone else." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. "You've been building this," he said. "Since the beginning. I've been paying attention," she said. "That's different." "Is it?" She met his eyes. "I'm not building something against anyone, Mr. Calloway. I'm trying to understand what's happening, so that when it gets worse, and it will get worse, there are people here who know they're not alone." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" It was the right question. Not, "What are you going to do?" or "Don't get involved," or any of the things men said when they were nervous about a woman moving faster than they expected. Just, "What do you need?" Clara felt something ease slightly in her chest. "Time," she said. "And your trust." He gave her both without another word. The first serious blow came on a Monday morning, and it came fast. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard Pete shout from outside. Not alarm exactly, but the particular edge in a young man's voice when he's found something wrong that he doesn't know how to handle. She was out the back door before she'd made a conscious decision to move. The supply wagon had come back from town the night before and been stored in the barn. Now it was sitting in the yard, and the bags of flour and cornmeal she'd ordered were torn open. The contents ruined not by accident, not by animals. Cut, deliberately. With something sharp and intentional. 400 pounds of staple supplies. Gone. Pete was standing over it with his hands on his hips and fury on his face. "I locked that barn," he said. "I know I locked it. I checked it myself." Clara looked at the bags. She looked at the cut pattern. She looked at Pete. "I believe you," she said. "Who does this?" Pete demanded. "Who comes onto a man's property in the night, and who does this?" Clara put a hand briefly on his arm, just a moment, just enough. "Go get Mr. Calloway," she said. Quietly, Don't make a scene in the yard." Wyatt came out and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he turned around and went back inside. Clara followed. He was standing in the kitchen with his back to her when she came in, both hands flat on the counter, and she could see the controlled quality of his breathing, the specific discipline of a man keeping himself from the edge of something. "Mercer," he said, "almost certainly. That's $400 of supplies." "Yes." He turned around. His face was composed, but his eyes were doing something complicated. "This isn't going to stop," he said. "No." Clara agreed. "It isn't. Then I should—" "You should not do anything rash," Clara said with quiet precision. "That is exactly what he wants. He wants you to react. He wants you angry and isolated and making decisions you can't take back." She held his gaze. "Don't give him that." Wyatt stared at her. The muscles along his jaw were working. "Clara," he said her given name again without seeming to notice. "That was our winter supplies." "I know." She was already thinking. "I'm going to the Hargroves today, and the Brennans. I'll have replacement supplies pooled before the week is out." "You can't." "I can," she said. "Let me." He looked at her for a long time. This woman who kept calmly disassembling every argument he made for despair, who kept showing him without fanfare that the thing he thought was impossible had already been done. "All right," he said quietly. She went. By Thursday, the combined generosity of 6 families had replaced everything that had been destroyed, and Clara had cooked dinner for each of them in return, and sat with each of them long enough to say simply and plainly what she was starting to believe. "We have to do this together. Every one of us. Because the only way he wins is if we stay separate." Nobody argued with her, not a single person. That was when Clara understood that she hadn't just been feeding people for 2 months. She'd been building something. A web of connection, of obligation, of reciprocal care that now existed between 12 families who had each been slowly drowning alone. Mercer had been counting on their isolation. He had engineered it, the pressure, the fear, the sense of shame that kept people from admitting what was happening to them. He had separated them deliberately because united they were stronger than anything he could throw at them. He hadn't counted on the cook from Billings who noticed things. The big twist hit on a Friday night, and it hit from an angle nobody was watching. Clara was asleep when Emma knocked on her door. It was past midnight. She knew immediately from the quality of the knock, quick, sharp, trying to be controlled, that something was wrong. She opened the door. Emma was fully dressed, her face pale, her eyes doing that thing they did when she was trying not to show fear. "There's a fire," she said. "North pasture." Clara was moving before Emma finished the sentence. The fire had started in the dry grass along the fence line of the north pasture, where 80 head of cattle were grazing. It moved fast. August grass, and no rain for 3 weeks, made for conditions that didn't need much encouragement. The hands were already out there, Wyatt among them, working with blankets and shovels, and shouted instructions that carried back to the house in fragments. Clara made an immediate decision. She went back to the kitchen. She built the fire in the range up fast and hot, and she started cooking, not for the moment, but for the next 6 hours. Because she knew what men who were fighting a fire needed at 2 in the morning, and at 4 in the morning, and at 6, when they were done, and standing on their feet, on nothing but adrenaline and ash. She made coffee in every pot she had. She made food substantial fast hot, and she kept making it. Emma appeared in the doorway again. "Can I help?" "Wash your hands," Clara said. They worked side by side, the woman and the girl in the kitchen that had once been cold and was now the warmest room in the territory, while outside the men fought back the fire with everything they had. The cattle were saved. The fence was mostly destroyed. 2 acres of grazing land burned. One of the outbuildings was lost entirely, a storage shed that Pete had been using gone to the ground before anyone could get to it. When Wyatt came in just after 4 in the morning with ash on his face and exhaustion in every line of his body, Clara put a plate and a cup in front of him and said nothing. He sat. He ate. After a long time he said, "The storage shed was locked. Same lock as the barn." Clara looked at him. Same person. Yes. The word sat between them like a stone. He's escalating, Wyatt said. Yes. He looked at his hands, rough, capable, familiar hands that she had watched work for 2 months and had come to recognize the way she recognized things she had no intention of naming. Clem's shoulder gave out fighting the fire, he said. He wouldn't stop. I had to physically make him step back. I'll look at it in the morning. Pete burned his hands, not bad, but I'll look at those too. Wyatt lifted his eyes to her face. The exhaustion was real, but underneath it something else was moving. Something that had been building for weeks and was now in this particular moment at 4 a.m. with ash on his face and her sitting across from him having cooked all night for people she'd known for 2 months, threatening to surface. Why are you still here? He asked, not accusatory, genuinely asking. Clara held his gaze. Because this is where the work is, she said. Clara? He stopped. Wyatt. She said his name back to him the first time, deliberate and calm. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, I haven't called this place home in 4 years. She understood what he meant. Not the word, the weight behind it, what it cost him to say it. It's starting to feel like one, she said simply. He nodded once. He didn't trust himself with more than that. In the morning, when the sun came up and the valley lay quiet and slightly damaged but not destroyed, Clara went out to the yard and found all 6 remaining hands already at work, repairing what could be repaired. Nobody had told them to start. Nobody had given instructions. They had just woken up and begun. She stood there watching them and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Not happiness exactly. The situation was too serious for happiness. But something related to it. The particular warmth of looking at a thing and knowing that you helped make it possible. That without you, these people would still be moving through this hardship alone. She was still standing there when Ruth Hargrove arrived in a wagon. Then the Brennans behind her. Then old Mrs. Meeker with her husband moving slowly but moving. Then the Aldreds. One by one, every family she had cooked for, visited, listened to, sat with they came. Not because anyone had called them. Because word had traveled the way word traveled in small communities from neighbor to neighbor in the night, and they had come to do what neighbors did. By noon, the fence was half rebuilt. By late afternoon, the cleared land had been assessed, and plans were being made for replanting. Children ran between the working adults with water and food that multiple women had brought and laid out on tables in the yard. Wyatt stood beside Clara at one point, both of them watching the yard that had been quiet for years now, alive with people. You did this, he said. They did this, she said. You brought them here. I just fed people, Clara said. He turned and looked at her, really looked at her, the full weight of his attention, the kind of look a man gives when he has stopped pretending he doesn't see something. No, he said quietly. You didn't just feed people. Clara felt the weight of his look. She felt the truth in it. She didn't argue. What she felt standing there with the sound of her community around her was something she recognized from a long time ago. From before Thomas died. From before the restaurant failed and the money ran out and the long road north began. The feeling of being in the right place. The feeling of being needed in ways that were real and true and sufficient. She had come here looking for honest work. What she had found was far harder than that and far more important. And what frightened her, what kept her awake that night long after the yard was empty and the house was quiet, was not Mercer or the fire, or the escalating threat, or any of the very real dangers pressing in from outside. What frightened her was Wyatt's voice at 4 a.m. saying, I haven't called this place home in 4 years, and the fact that when he said it, something in her chest had moved toward him the way a plant moves toward light, without permission, without plan, without any regard whatsoever for what she'd told him the first day she arrived. She told herself it was nothing. For 3 days after the fire, Clara told herself that what she'd felt standing next to Wyatt in the yard, that particular pulling sensation, that warmth moving toward him without permission, was simply the product of exhaustion and proximity and high emotion. She had been awake most of the night cooking. She had watched people she cared about fight a fire that could have taken everything. She had been frightened, and fear did things to people's feelings, rearranged them, made things feel more significant than they were. She told herself this with the same practical discipline she applied to everything else. She almost believed it. What didn't help was Emma. Emma had changed in ways that were subtle enough that a person not paying attention would have missed them entirely. She sat straighter at meals. She laughed more, not the cautious testing kind of laughter that children produce when they're not sure it's allowed, but real laughter, unguarded, the kind that surprised even her when it came out. She had started asking Clara questions about cooking that went beyond the practical, not just how do you make this, but why does this work, and what happens if you change that questions with curiosity, underneath them the specific intellectual hunger of a child who has discovered that learning is pleasurable. And she had started quietly, and without announcement, doing small things for Clara that Clara hadn't asked for. A cup of coffee waiting when Clara came down early. The kitchen swept before Clara got to it. The water brought in from the pump without being told. Clara noticed every single one and said nothing about it directly because she understood that Emma was doing what children do when they love someone, not saying it, because saying it was too large and too frightening, but demonstrating it in the smallest and most reliable ways available. The problem was that Clara was starting to love her back, not like a mother. She was careful about that, careful not to step into a shape that didn't belong to her, careful not to be something the girl hadn't asked for, but something adjacent to that, something real in particular and growing the way things grow when the conditions are right, whether you intend them to or not. On the fourth day after the fire, Clara was in the kitchen when she heard Wyatt and Emma in the next room. She wasn't eavesdropping, she simply hadn't moved yet, and their voices carried. Emma said, "Papa, do you like Mrs. Bennet?" A pause. Wyatt said, "She works hard, she's good at what she does." Emma said, "That's not what I asked." Another pause. Longer. "Go finish your schoolwork," Wyatt said. Clara pressed her lips together and turned back to the stove. She heard Emma's footsteps move away, and then a long silence, and then Wyatt's step in the hall, pausing briefly outside the kitchen doorway the way he always did, and then moving on. She kept cooking. The next blow came from a direction she hadn't anticipated, and it came on a Tuesday, and it came in the form of a legal document. Jed brought it in from the road. A courier had ridden out from town, he said, and asked him to deliver it to Mr. Calloway directly. Wyatt opened it at the kitchen table with Clara nearby and read it once, and she watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do before. Not anger. Something underneath anger. The specific, sick expression of a man who has just been shown that the ground he's standing on is not what he believed it to be. He set the paper down. "Mercer is filing a claim," he said. "He says the eastern boundary of this ranch was incorrectly surveyed in 1879. He has documentation, a surveyor's report, that places the spring on his side of the property line." Clara went very still. "Is it legitimate?" "I don't know." He picked the paper up again, looked at it, set it down. "The original survey was done by a man named Aldous Pratt. Pratt died 2 years ago." He paused. "Convenient. Can it be challenged?" "It can be challenged if I can produce counter-evidence. The original survey records. Witness testimony from people who were there in 1879. He rubbed his hand over his face, the first genuinely tired gesture she'd seen from him in weeks. "Clara, I was 14 years old in 1879. My father bought this land and put up the fences, and everyone in the county knew where the boundary was. But knowing and proving are two entirely different things." Clara sat down across from him. "How much time do we have?" "The county hearing is in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. She turned it over in her mind. 6 weeks to find documentation for a survey done 9 years ago by a man who is now dead, contesting a claim backed by one of the most powerful men in the territory. She looked at Wyatt's face, at the exhaustion in it, and underneath the exhaustion, something older. The weight of a man who had been fighting alone for a very long time. "There are people who were here in 1879, she said slowly. "Neighbors. Old-timers. People who remember where those fences were laid. Mercer's lawyers will argue that memory isn't documentation. Maybe, Clara said, but 11 families standing up in a county hearing and saying the same thing is harder to dismiss than one man's word. She paused. And there may be documentation we haven't found yet. Your father, did he keep records? Wyatt looked at her. There are boxes in the back of the storage room. I haven't been through them since he died. Then that's where we start. He didn't move immediately. He was still looking at her with that expression, the one that had been appearing more frequently, the one she kept trying not to read too carefully. Why are you doing this? He asked. His voice was low and completely serious. This is not cooking. This is not what I hired you for. This is the ranch, Clara said. And I told you I don't walk away from work I've committed to. Clara? He stopped. His jaw worked. I can't pay you for this. I'm not asking you to. Then why? Because it matters, she said simply. Because Emma matters. Because those 11 families matter. Because the right thing is occasionally its own sufficient reason. She held his gaze. Now, are you going to help me go through those boxes, or are you going to sit there arguing with me about why I'm doing it? A beat passed. Then, for the first time since she'd known him, Wyatt Calloway almost smiled. The boxes are in the back, he said. They went through them together that evening, while Emma sat at the kitchen table doing her schoolwork, and occasionally coming to the doorway to observe and then retreating when she thought she was being noticed. The boxes contained the accumulated record of a man's life. Wyatt's father, Robert Calloway, who had come to Montana Territory in 1874 with a land grant and a particular stubbornness that his son had clearly inherited. There were letters, receipts, contracts with neighbors and suppliers, and at the bottom of the third box, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept it dry for 9 years, a bound ledger with Property Records Calloway Ranch written on the cover in careful handwriting. Clara found it. She opened it. She read the first 3 pages. Then she looked up at Wyatt. Your father drew his own maps, she said. Wyatt leaned over. His shoulder was inches from hers. He read what she was reading, and she felt the moment it hit him, the slight intake of breath, the stillness. The ledger contained hand-drawn property maps, detailed and dated with the boundary lines marked in ink that had barely faded. The spring was clearly marked within the Calloway boundary, with a note in Robert Calloway's handwriting. Freshwater Spring Eastern Meadow. Confirmed by County Assessor Henderson. October 1879. Henderson, Wyatt said. James Henderson. He was the county assessor. Is he still alive? He'd be 70 maybe. He retired, moved to his daughter's place outside of... Wyatt stopped. Outside of Clement Falls. That's 40 miles. That's 2 days by wagon, Clara said. He turned and looked at her from a distance of about 8 inches. This close, she could see things she usually kept herself from looking at. Directly, the particular gray of his eyes, the lines at their corners that came from years of squinting into weather. The way his expression, unguarded, at this specific moment, was something entirely different from the closed and careful face he showed the world. I'll go, he said. We should send word first, Clara said. Make sure he's there and willing to speak. She paused. I know someone who can get a letter to Clement Falls by Friday. Ruth Hargrove's brother drives the mail route. Wyatt looked at her for another moment. You know everything, he said. Not with frustration, with something that sounded almost like wonder. I know the people, she said. That's not the same as everything. The letter went Friday. The response came the following Wednesday, and it was better than they had hoped. James Henderson was alive, was in good health, remembered the Calloway survey clearly, and said in his reply, which was written in the steady hand of a man who had spent 30 years keeping official records, that he would be glad to provide testimony, and that he still had his own copy of the original assessment in his files. When Clara read it aloud at the kitchen table, Pete let out a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a shout. Jed closed his eyes briefly. Clem set down his coffee cup with a click that was more emphatic than necessary. Wyatt read it himself twice, then looked up. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him. That's one piece. she said, keeping her voice level, keeping herself from the feeling that was trying to rise in her chest. We need more. They got more. Over the following 2 weeks, Clara did something that she had been building toward since the first Sunday supper, since the first conversation with Ruth. Since the first evening, she'd understood that isolation was Mercer's primary weapon. She called the families together again, not for supper this time, but for a meeting. At the Calloway Ranch around the long table that the hands usually ate at with the extra chairs brought in from every room in the house. 11 families. 23 adults. All of them knowing by now that what Mercer was doing to Wyatt was simply the most visible version of what he'd been doing to all of them. Clara spoke plainly, the way she always spoke. There's a hearing in 4 weeks. Mr. Calloway needs witnesses. People who were here in 1879, or whose parents were, who can speak to where those boundary lines were. He also needs people to stand up in that hearing room and make it clear to the county that this isn't one man's problem. It's 12 families' problem. It's this whole valley's problem. She stopped. She waited. Daniel Hargrove spoke first. He spoke slowly from his chair because his back still wouldn't let him stand for long. My father built his first fence using the Calloway line as his reference point, he said. I grew up knowing exactly where that line was. I'll say so in front of any judge in Montana. Then, old Mr. Meeker, who had barely spoken in any meeting Clara had attended, said in his quiet, particular voice, I was 22 years old when Robert Calloway put in that eastern fence. I helped him dig the post holes. I know where that spring is, and I know whose land it's on, and I'll say so until I don't have breath left to say it. One by one around the table people spoke. Clara sat quietly through it and felt the thing she had been building for 3 months finally become what it was always going to be. Not her project, not her plan, but theirs. This community's. These people who had been afraid and isolated and were now something else entirely. She looked at Wyatt across the table. He was looking at her already. She looked away first. That night, after everyone had gone, Emma helped Clara wash the cups and plates from the meeting, and somewhere in the quiet domestic rhythm of the work, Emma said without looking up from what her hands were doing, Mama used to do things like this. Clara kept her hands moving. Like what? Bring people together. She was the one who, she always knew what to do when things were hard. Emma paused. Her voice was careful in the way voices are careful when they're carrying something fragile. Papa got quieter after she died. Like he was afraid to, like he thought if he cared about things too much he'd lose them. Clara was very still inside, even though her hands kept moving. He cares, she said gently. He's always cared. He just forgot for a while how to show it. Emma looked up. Her serious gray eyes, her father's eyes, were doing something complicated. Do you think he's remembering? She asked. Clara looked at this girl. This 12-year-old girl who had grown up in a house where grief had made everything quiet and careful. Who had stopped going into the kitchen for 4 years because the kitchen was where her mother had been, who now came in every morning before anyone else was awake to leave a cup of coffee for a woman she'd known for 3 months. I think he's trying, Clara said. That's enough for now. Emma nodded slowly. Then she said very quietly, I'm glad you came. Clara set down what she was holding. She looked at Emma steadily. Me too, she said. The hardest moment came 4 days before the hearing, and it came from Wyatt. He found her in the kitchen late in the evening, and she knew from the quality of his footstep, heavier than usual, slower, that something was different. He sat down at the table. He sat there for a moment without speaking. Then he said, I need to tell you something. Clara sat across from him. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that costs something. Then he said, Eleanor didn't die of an illness. Clara waited. She wasn't well in ways that didn't show on the outside. She was lonely. I was always working. I told myself it was for the ranch, for our future, for Emma, all the things men tell themselves when they don't want to admit that they've been absent from their own lives. He stopped. His hands on the table were still. She told me the spring before she died that she felt like a stranger in her own house. I told her things would get better when the season turned. He paused. She died in August. The season had turned. Nothing was better. Clara said nothing. She let him say what he needed to say. She died believing I cared more about this land than I did about her, he said. And the honest, terrible truth is that I gave her good reason to believe it. I was here. I was always here. But I was absent in every way that mattered. His voice was controlled, but something underneath it was raw. Emma knew. Children always know. That's why she didn't talk for months after. That's why the kitchen went cold. He stopped again. I told myself I didn't want anyone here because I only needed a cook, because the ranch needed practical help, because I'd gotten along without... He stopped. His jaw tightened. Because if I didn't let anyone in, I couldn't fail anyone again. The room was very quiet. Clara looked at him, at this man who had carried this for 4 years in silence, who had made his grief into a fortress and called it practicality, who had said, I need a cook, not a wife, on the day she arrived, and meant it as a warning to himself as much as to her. She said carefully, You didn't cause Eleanor's death, Wyatt. I didn't prevent it either. That is not the same as causing it. Her voice was gentle, but she didn't soften the truth of it. What you did was the same thing most people do when they love something. You worked hard for it, and you assumed the working was enough. You were wrong about that. But being wrong about something, even something that cost you everything, is not the same as being beyond forgiveness. He looked at her. Who forgives me? He asked. It wasn't rhetorical. He was genuinely asking. Emma, Clara said. She already has. She just needs you to let her. She paused. And you forgive yourself. That's harder, but it's the only part that matters. Wyatt's eyes were very bright in the lamplight. I haven't talked about this, he said. Not to anyone. I know. Why did I just... He stopped. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Because you've been ready to, she said. For a while now. She paused. And because you trust me. He didn't answer that directly. But he held her gaze for a moment that was longer than practical, and in it was everything he hadn't said, and might not have words for yet. Then he said quietly, The hearing is in 4 days. I know, she said. Whatever happens. He stopped. Whatever happens, Clara said firmly. You are not facing it alone. He nodded once. He stood. He paused at the doorway. Clara, he said. She looked up. He looked at her, one long, steady look, the full weight of a man who had spent years not allowing himself to see something, and was now finally seeing it clearly. Thank you, he said, for all of it. He left. Clara sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the lamp burning low, the house quiet around her. She thought about Eleanor Calloway, who had died feeling like a stranger in her own home. She thought about Thomas, who had loved her completely, and left anyway because that was what death did regardless of love. She thought about the hearing in 4 days. She thought about 11 families who were going to walk into a county courthouse and stand up for something bigger than any one of them alone. She thought about a man who had said, I need a cook, not a wife, and had slowly, without intending to, without permission, without any plan at all, come to need something entirely different. And she sat with the full, terrifying weight of the fact that she needed it too. The morning of the hearing, Clara was up before 4. She didn't sleep the last 2 hours anyway, just lay in the dark, listening to the ranch breathe around her, the way she'd come to know its sounds over 4 months, the way she knew her own heartbeat, the creak of the board outside Emma's room, the particular settling of the kitchen floor, the distant sound of the horses. She knew this place now, the way you only know somewhere you've stopped being a visitor to. She got up. She built the fire. She started cooking. By the time Wyatt came downstairs, there was a full breakfast on the table. Not because anyone needed elaborate food this particular morning, but because Clara's hands needed to be doing something, or her mind would do too much. He came in and stopped when he saw the spread of it, and for a moment he just stood there in the doorway, with his hat in his hands, looking at her the way he'd been looking at her more and more often lately. like a man who keeps finding something where he least expected it and still isn't entirely accustomed to the surprise. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit down." He sat. Emma appeared minutes later, already dressed with unusual care, her hair braided neatly, her good dress, her face set with the particular determination of a 12-year-old who has decided to be older than she is for one day. She sat beside her father and looked at the food and looked at Clara and said, "Are we going to win?" Clara set a plate in front of her. "We're going to tell the truth," she said. "In my experience, that's the strongest thing you can bring into any room." Emma absorbed this. Then she picked up her fork and said, "That's not an answer." "It's the only honest one," Clara said. Wyatt across the table caught Clara's eye for just a moment. Something passed between them. Not words, not yet, but the specific current that had been building for months between two people who understood each other and were still carefully finding the courage to say so. Then he looked at his daughter. "Eat your breakfast," he said. "We leave in an hour." The courthouse in Harlan County was a two-story building that smelled of wood polish and old paper, and the specific institutional gravity of a place where decisions got made. Clara had been in courtrooms before once after Thomas died for the settling of his estate, which had been brief and painful, and left her with nothing but a clear understanding of how little protection the law offered to a woman alone. She walked into this one differently. She walked in as part of something. The families filled the benches on Wyatt's side of the room in a way that made a statement before anyone said a word. The Hargroves Daniel, moving slowly but moving. The Meekers, both of them old Mr. Meeker, with his hat held carefully in both hands. The Brennans, the Polks, the Aldreds, and 7 other families whose names Clara now knew and whose kitchens she had sat in and whose children she had fed. 23 adults arranged themselves behind Wyatt Calloway, and the sight of it, the sheer solid weight of it, made Mercer's lawyer pause when he entered and look at the room and then look again. Hank Mercer himself sat at the opposing table. Clara had never seen him before. He was not what she'd imagined. She had constructed something monstrous in her mind, some obvious villain, and what she found instead was a man in his 50s, with a prosperous belly, and the face of someone who had spent so long believing he was reasonable that he had confused reasonableness with being right. He looked at the room full of people on Wyatt's side, and his expression flickered. Not fear exactly, but the specific recalibration of a man who has walked into a situation he thought he controlled and found something he hadn't accounted for. He found Clara. He didn't know who she was, but he looked at her the way men like him always eventually looked at women who were behind something they couldn't immediately explain, with a dismissive curiosity that was its own kind of mistake. Clara looked back at him steadily. She didn't look away first. The county judge was a man named Foster. Gray-haired and deliberate, with the patience of someone who had presided over enough disputes to know that the loudest party in the room was rarely the one with the strongest case. He called the hearing to order, and the room went quiet. Mercer's lawyer presented first. He was good. Clara gave him that. He had documents. He had the forged surveyor's report. He had a carefully assembled argument about the property boundary that sounded, if you didn't know what you were listening for, entirely plausible. He spoke for 40 minutes. He used words like historical record and documented evidence and good faith dispute, and the room listened with the particular careful attention of people who understood that the outcome of this hearing would determine whether they had water come dry season. Wyatt's lawyer, a younger man from Billings, who Clara had helped identify through Ruth Hargrove's network of contacts, presented the counter case. He began with Robert Calloway's ledger. He laid it open on the table and read the relevant entries aloud, including the note about the county assessor's confirmation in October of 1879. He presented the letter from James Henderson, who had been unable to make the trip from Clement Falls due to health, but had provided a signed and notarized affidavit, confirming the original survey and attesting to the location of the boundary line. Mercer's lawyer objected to the affidavit. The judge overruled him. Then the witnesses began. Old Mr. Meeker went first. He walked to the front of the room, slowly stood without assistance, and spoke in his quiet, specific voice about the autumn of 1879. And the fence posts he had helped Robert Calloway set into the frozen ground with his own hands. He gave distances. He gave landmarks. He spoke about the spring as though he could see it from where he stood, which, in some sense, Clara suspected he could, the way very old people carry the landscapes of their younger years inside them with perfect clarity. Mercer's lawyer cross-examined him for 10 minutes, trying to find inconsistencies in his memory, and found none. Mr. Meeker answered every question with the patient precision of a man who knew exactly what he remembered and why. Daniel Hargrove spoke next, then 2 other men who had been in the valley since before the survey. Each of them told the same story from different angles in different words, with the specific credibility of people who have nothing to gain from their testimony except the truth of it. Clara sat in the gallery through all of it, with her hands folded in her lap, and Emma pressed close against her side, the girl's shoulder warm against hers, both of them very still. Then Mercer's lawyer did something that Clara had been half expecting and fully dreading. He stood up and said, "Your Honor, we would like to call a witness, a woman who has been residing at the Calloway Ranch for the past 4 months and who may be able to provide relevant testimony regarding the nature of the arrangements at that property." The room shifted. Clara felt it, the collective intake of attention. Wyatt turned in his seat and looked at her. His face was controlled, but his eyes were doing something urgent. Judge Foster said, "Does this witness have relevant testimony regarding the property dispute?" Mercer's lawyer smiled the particular smile of a man deploying something unpleasant. "She may be able to speak to certain arrangements between the parties that would help the court understand the full context of Mr. Calloway's position." Clara understood immediately. This was not about testimony. This was about her. About who she was and what she was doing at the ranch, and what implication could be drawn from a widow living on a widower's property. It was an attempt to make the hearing about something else entirely, to shift the room's attention from the forged survey to the question of Clara's character, and by extension, Wyatt's, and by extension the legitimacy of everything they'd brought. She stood up before anyone asked her to. "I'll speak," she said clearly. Wyatt said low and firm, "Clara, you don't have to." "I know," she said. She looked at him for one steady moment. "Let me." She walked to the front of the room. She stood where the other witnesses had stood. She looked at the judge, not at Mercer's lawyer, because she had learned a long time ago that you addressed the person with the power to decide, not the person trying to distract you. "My name is Clara Bennett," she said. "I am a widow from Laramie, Wyoming. I was hired by Mr. Calloway as a ranch cook 4 months ago. I cook 3 meals a day, manage the household supplies, and assist in the coordination of the ranch's relationships with neighboring properties." She paused. "If there's a specific question about my role, I'm happy to answer it." Mercer's lawyer stepped forward. "Mrs. Bennett, would you say your relationship with Mr. Calloway has been strictly professional?" The room was absolutely silent. Clara looked at the lawyer. She thought about all the ways she could answer that question. She thought about the kitchen at 4 in the morning, and the fire, and Wyatt carrying a pot that was too heavy, and Emma's note that said they were good, and the evening he told her about Eleanor, and the specific, unbearable weight of the trust that had been building between them for months. She said, "Mr. Calloway hired me to do a job. I have done that job. I have also, as neighbors do in a hard country, assisted the people around me in whatever ways I was able. If that is what you're asking about, then yes, my relationship with the Calloway Ranch has extended beyond cooking meals, because that is what human decency requires when people you care about are under attack." She stopped. The room was still quiet, but the quality of the quiet had changed. "Mr. Calloway is a man of complete integrity," she said, and she said it looking directly at Hank Mercer, not his lawyer. "He refused to sell land that has been in his family for 14 years, not because he is stubborn, but because he understood what the rest of this valley took a little longer to see, that this is not about one ranch. It is about whether the people of this valley get to keep what they built, or whether a man with enough money can simply take it from them by filing papers with forged signatures." Mercer's lawyer said sharply, "Objection. I'm not finished," Clara said. Judge Foster said, "Let her finish." She looked at the judge. "I came to this county looking for honest work. What I found was a community of people who were being systematically pressured to give up their homes, and a man at the center of it who believed that isolation and fear were sufficient weapons against ordinary people." She paused. "He was wrong about that. These families." She gestured to the benches behind Wyatt without looking away from the judge. "Know their history, they know their land, and they know the difference between a legal document and a manufactured one." She stepped back. The room erupted. Not chaos, but the specific animated noise of a crowd that has just heard something shift. Judge Foster called for order and got it within 30 seconds. Mercer's lawyer tried to continue. He raised procedural objections. He questioned the credibility of the affidavit. He argued chain of custody for the ledger. The judge listened to all of it with the patience that was his professional characteristic. Then he asked Mercer's lawyer to produce the original surveyor's report. Not a copy, the original. With the original surveyor's signature verified by a living witness to its signing. The lawyer conferred with Mercer in rapid, urgent whispers. He could not produce the original, because there wasn't one. The twist that followed was not dramatic in the way that stories sometimes make things dramatic. No shouting, no confession, no collapse. It was quieter than that, and more devastating. Judge Foster requested an adjournment of 1 hour. When he returned, he brought with him a document from the Territorial Land Office that had been located during the break. The original 1879 survey, filed with the county, which matched Robert Calloway's ledger precisely, and bore James Henderson's official seal and signature. The surveyor's report Mercer had filed was a forgery, not a subtle one. It turned out the territorial record had a different set of measurements entirely, and the discrepancy was not explainable by anything except deliberate alteration. Judge Foster looked at Hank Mercer for a long moment. Then he ruled. The Calloway property boundary was confirmed as established in the 1879 survey. Mercer's claim was dismissed. The judge further ordered that the forged document be referred to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for investigation into fraud. Mercer sat very still at his table for a moment. Then he stood, said something quietly to his lawyer, and walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone. He didn't look at Clara. She watched him go anyway. Behind her, the room broke open. Not wildly, these were people who had spent months being afraid, and relief didn't always come out as celebration. It came out as hands gripped, as breath released, as Ruth Hargrove pressing her face briefly against her husband's shoulder, as old Mr. Meeker standing very straight and nodding once to himself with the satisfaction of a man who has done what he came to do. Emma threw her arms around Clara from behind, sudden and fierce, and Clara caught her and held on. Wyatt was standing a few feet away. He was looking at Clara. He had been looking at her, she realized, since the moment she stood up and walked to the front of that room. She released Emma gently. She crossed the few feet to where Wyatt stood. He said nothing for a moment. His jaw was working in the way it did when the thing he needed to say was larger than the words available. Then he said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know. You didn't have to say any of that. I know, Wyatt. Clara." He stopped. He started again. "In front of all those people you said what was true," she said. "That's all I did." He looked at her. The courtroom was alive around them with the movement and noise of 23 people who had just been given back their futures, and he looked at her as though they were the only two people in the room. "Come home," he said. It was 2 words. But they were the right 2 words, carrying the full specific weight of everything that couldn't be said yet. Not in this room, not in this moment, but soon, carrying the certainty of it. "Yes," she said. They rode home with Emma between them on the wagon seat, the girl talking with the unstoppable energy of someone for whom relief had converted directly into words, describing every moment of the hearing in vivid detail to both of them, as though they hadn't been present for it. Clara listened and answered and laughed in the right places, and felt Wyatt's arm occasionally brush hers with the wagon's movement, and didn't move away from it. That evening the families came again. Not planned, not organized. They simply came one by one in wagons and on horseback, appearing in the Calloway yard, with food and lanterns and children who ran immediately to find other children. Someone brought a fiddle. Someone else brought 2 jugs of the best cider in the territory. Clara went to the kitchen and cooked, and people came in and helped her without being asked, and she let them, and the kitchen was so full of people that it was warm in the way that had nothing to do with the stove. At one point, she looked up from what she was doing and saw Emma standing in the middle of it all with her arms crossed and a look of fierce proprietary satisfaction on her face. "This is mine, this house, these people, this warmth." And Clara felt something complete itself inside her, something that had been slowly assembling for 4 months. Later, when the celebration had wound down and the last families had headed home with lanterns swinging, Emma fell asleep on the parlor sofa, and Wyatt carried her to bed with the practiced ease of a father who has done it 1,000 times. Clara finished the last of the kitchen work alone. She was standing at the counter when she heard his step return. He came in. He stood a few feet from her. The kitchen was quiet. "There's something I've been working up to saying," he said. Clara turned around. He looked at her with that direct, unguarded gaze that she had learned was his truest face. The one underneath the closed shutters. The one that had been slowly appearing more often over 4 months of meals and crises and 4 in-the-morning conversations, and one fire and one courthouse, and every small, ordinary moment between them that had turned out not to be ordinary at all. "I said something to you the first day you came here," he said. "You said several things. One in particular," he paused. "I need a cook, not a wife." The words hung between them. "I remember," she said quietly. "I was wrong," he said. "Not about needing a cook. You are the finest cook I've ever encountered, and this ranch would have fallen apart without you." He stopped. He started again with the care of a man who does not say important things carelessly. "But I was wrong about the rest of it. About what I needed. About what I was capable of. About what was possible here." He took a step toward her. "You walked in here with 1 bag and 3 miles of dust on you, and you looked me in the eye and told me you didn't come to be a wife. And I believed you. And then you spent 4 months being everything I didn't know I was missing." Clara's throat was tight. "I'm not asking you anything tonight," he said. "I'm not going to ask you anything until you've had time to, until we've had. I know this isn't simple, and you've got your own history, and I've got mine, and Emma is—" "Wyatt," Clara said. He stopped. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face moved, shifted, opened the way a door opens that has been shut against the weather for a very long time. "Will you stay?" he asked. "Not as the cook, not as an employee. Will you stay because this is your home now too, if you want it to be?" Clara looked at this man who had said, "I need a cook," and meant "I am afraid," and who had slowly, painfully, honestly found his way back to his own heart over 4 months of her refusing to let the house stay cold. She thought about what she'd told Emma, that the right answer wasn't always the safe one, and that staying was sometimes the bravest thing a person could do. She thought about how she'd walked 3 miles with a bag on her shoulder and knocked on a stranger's door because she needed honest work. She thought about everything that had grown from that knock, all of it unplanned and real, and more than she'd known how to hope for. "Yes," she said. "I'll stay." He crossed the last of the distance between them and took her hands in both of his. Those large, work-roughened hands she'd watched for months and held them the way you hold something you are not going to let go of. They stood there in the kitchen that had been cold for 4 years and was now the warmest room in Montana, and neither of them needed to say anything more that night because the saying was done, and what was left was simply true. 6 months later, on a Saturday in late spring, with the valley green and the spring running clear in the eastern meadow, they married on the ranch they had fought for together. Every family in the valley came. Ruth Hargrove cried. Old Mr. Meeker wore his best suit and danced once carefully with his wife. Pete caught Emma's eye across the yard, and they both laughed about something only they understood. Jed shook Wyatt's hand for a long time, without saying anything, and Wyatt gripped back just as hard, and that was enough. Emma stood beside Clara through the ceremony with her hand tucked into Clara's arm, and when it was done, she looked up at her and said with the absolute certainty of a child who has decided something completely, "I knew from the biscuits." Clara laughed. "From the biscuits?" "The first night," Emma said. "They were perfect, and I thought somebody who makes biscuits like that is staying." Clara pulled the girl close and held on. Wyatt beside them said, "She's not wrong. Those were exceptional biscuits." "They were butter and attention," Clara said. "That's most of it," Wyatt said. He looked at her, his wife, his partner, the woman who had walked into his cold house and refused to let it stay that way. "Turns out that's most of everything." The ranch that had been quiet for too long was loud now with the right kind of noise, people and children and animals and laughter, and the particular beautiful chaos of a life that is full. The house that had felt like a shell had a heartbeat again. Clara Bennett had come to Montana looking for honest work. What she found was a man learning to live again, a girl learning to trust again, a community learning to stand together, and a home she hadn't known she was looking for until she was already in it, already essential to it, already loved by it, already changed forever, by the people who, without knowing it, had needed her exactly as much as she had needed them. She had not come to be a wife, but she had become something rarer and more permanent than that, the person without whom none of it, not the ranch, not the family, not the valley, not the man, would ever have been whole again. And that was a thing no one could take away, no forged document, no drought, no threat, no hardship that the Montana Territory could produce. It was true, it was earned, it was hers, and it was forever.